The moment renowned violinist Darius Blackwell heard my sister Celeste play, his face went completely white. You see, he'd just spent 20 minutes publicly humiliating her in front of 300 people at Carnegie Hall's donor gala, calling her another tone-deaf wannabe who thinks money can buy talent. But when Celeste finally picked up that violin, everything changed. Before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. I'm Alex, and Celeste is my younger sister. She's 28, brilliant, and hasn't spoken a word out loud since she was 8 years old. Most people see her silence and assume she's broken, damaged, or simply not worth their time. They're wrong on all counts, but that night at Carnegie Hall, one man was about to learn just how wrong he could be. My sister communicates through sign language and writing, pouring her thoughts onto paper with the same precision she uses for everything else in her life. She has a master's degree in music theory, speaks 4 languages fluently through her hands, and can analyze a Bach composition like she's reading a children's book. But the world doesn't see any of that. They see a quiet woman who won't make eye contact and dismiss her immediately. Darius Blackwell saw exactly what everyone else saw that night. A 45-year-old violin virtuoso with an ego the size of Manhattan, Blackwell had built his reputation not just on his undeniable talent, but on his ability to humiliate anyone he deemed unworthy of sharing the same stage, the same room, or sometimes even the same planet as him. Music magazines loved quoting his brutal takedowns of amateur musicians, and he wore his cruelty like a badge of honor. Our mother, Patricia, had spent $30,000 on donor tickets to this gala, hoping it would help Celeste emerge from the grief that had consumed her since our father's death 3 months earlier. Mom believed that surrounding Celeste with beautiful music and elegant company might remind her that life still held joy worth living. She had no idea she was walking her daughter into a trap. The gala itself was everything you'd expect from Manhattan's cultural elite. Crystal chandeliers worth more than most people's houses, women in designer gowns that cost more than luxury cars, and men discussing art acquisitions like stock trades. It was the kind of event where your net worth determined your social standing, and everyone knew exactly where they ranked. Celeste had dressed carefully that night, wearing our father's vintage emerald necklace and a black dress that made her look like she belonged among the wealthy donors and cultural patrons. She carried Dad's violin case, a battered brown leather container that held his prized 1923 Italian instrument. He'd left it to her in his will, along with a note that simply read, "Your voice is in here, waiting." I should have seen the disaster coming. I should have noticed how people stared at Celeste, whispering among themselves about Patricia's strange, silent daughter. I should have recognized the predatory gleam in Darius Blackwell's eyes when he spotted what he assumed was easy prey. But I was too focused on making sure Celeste felt comfortable, too busy being her translator and protector to realize that some battles require no translation. That night, in front of 300 of New York's most influential people, my sister was about to prove that silence isn't the absence of power. Sometimes it's just the quiet before the storm. 3 months before that night at Carnegie Hall, our father collapsed in his study while reading. Heart attack. He was gone before the paramedics arrived, leaving behind a grieving wife, 2 devastated children, and a music room that suddenly felt like a shrine. Dad had been the only person who truly understood Celeste's gift. While the rest of the world saw her selective mutism as a limitation, he saw it as concentration. Every day after work, he'd sit in his leather chair and listen to her practice violin for hours in complete silence. No applause, no critiques, no pressure to perform for anyone else. Just pure musical conversation between a father and daughter, who both understood that some of the most beautiful things in life happen quietly. The accident that stole Celeste's voice happened when she was 8. We were driving home from her first violin recital, where she'd played beautifully in front of 50 people. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit us head-on. I walked away with bruises. Dad broke his arm. Mom needed stitches. But Celeste, who had been chattering excitedly about her performance moments before, never spoke again. The trauma counselor said it was psychological, that her voice would return when she felt safe enough to use it. 20 years later, we were still waiting. But Dad never stopped believing. He converted the basement into a soundproofed music room where Celeste could practice without judgment or pressure. He bought her the finest instruments, hired the best, private teachers who understood her needs, and never once suggested that her silence made her incomplete. While Mom worried about Celeste's social isolation, and I focused on protecting her from cruel comments, Dad simply listened. After his funeral, Celeste disappeared into that music room for days at a time. We'd hear the violin through the walls, playing pieces that sounded like conversations with grief itself. Mom and I worried she was losing herself to depression, but when she finally emerged, she seemed different, stronger maybe, like she'd found something in those hours of solitude. That's when Mom suggested the Carnegie Hall Gala. Patricia Evans had always been Manhattan's most generous patron of the arts, writing checks that kept orchestras and opera companies alive. She genuinely believed that surrounding Celeste with beautiful music and cultured people might help her heal. It was the kind of optimistic thinking that made Mom wonderful and sometimes dangerously naive. The night of the gala, I watched Celeste get ready with unusual care. She spent an hour styling her dark hair, chose her makeup carefully, and wore Dad's emerald necklace like armor. When she picked up his violin case, I saw her hands trembling slightly, but her expression was determined. She signed to me. Dad always said this instrument has a voice. Tonight, maybe people will hear it. I should have realized then that she wasn't planning to simply attend the gala as a silent observer. The way she held that violin case, the careful way she'd dressed, the quiet determination in her eyes should have warned me that my sister was preparing for something much bigger than a social evening. Instead, I just offered her my arm and escorted her into what would become the most important night of her life. The trouble started during cocktail hour, when Darius Blackwell was holding court near the silent auction, like a king accepting tribute from his subjects. He'd been regaling a small crowd with stories about his upcoming European tour, dropping names of famous conductors and prestigious venues with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been told no. When he spotted Mom's donation pledge on the auction table, his eyes lit up with the calculating gleam of a predator recognizing opportunity. $30,000 bought you access to Manhattan's cultural elite, and Blackwell understood exactly how to leverage that access for maximum social advantage. He approached our family with the kind of synthetic charm that wealthy patrons ate up like expensive caviar. "Patricia, darling, what a generous contribution to the arts. I see musical appreciation runs in the family." His smile was perfectly practiced, but his eyes were already assessing Celeste with the cold precision of someone cataloging weaknesses. Mom beamed with pride, completely missing the undertone in his voice. She signed quickly to Celeste, then turned back to Blackwell with maternal enthusiasm. "This is my daughter Celeste. She's been studying violin for 20 years. She has such a gift." That's when Blackwell's mask slipped just enough to reveal the cruelty underneath. 20 years of study? How fascinating. And where has she performed? Lincoln Center? The Kennedy Center? The questions came with barbed edges, designed to expose what he already suspected. When Mom explained that Celeste preferred private practice, Blackwell's laugh was loud enough to turn heads at nearby tables. Private practice. How wonderfully modest. Of course, we all know that real musicians can't help but share their gifts with the world. It's almost compulsive, really. The humiliation escalated when his gaze fell on Dad's violin case, which Celeste had been holding protectively against her chest. "Oh, you brought an instrument. How delightfully prepared. Tell me, dear, what's your repertoire? Something appropriate for your skill level, I'm sure." By now, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the scent of impending social drama like sharks sensing blood in the water. These were people who attended galas for entertainment as much as charity, and Blackwell was providing exactly the kind of spectacle they craved. "I'll tell you what," Blackwell announced, his voice carrying across the room with theatrical projection. "Since you've been studying for 20 years, why don't you give us a little demonstration? I'm sure everyone would be absolutely delighted to hear what 2 decades of private lessons have accomplished." He gestured grandly toward the stage where his personal Stradivarius waited for the evening's scheduled performance. "My violin is right there, perfectly tuned and ready, unless, of course, you prefer your own charming little instrument." The crowd pressed closer, their whispered excitement building like pressure in a steam kettle. Someone actually giggled and said, "This should be entertaining." Another voice added, "How brave of her to try." I watched my sister's face flush red with humiliation and anger. Her hands moved in rapid, furious sign language that I translated without thinking. He's doing this because he thinks I can't defend myself. He thinks my silence makes me weak. But then something shifted in Celeste's expression. The embarrassment transformed into something harder, more determined. She looked directly at Blackwell for the first time, her dark eyes holding his gaze with unexpected steel, and I realized that my sister wasn't planning to retreat from this fight. She was planning to win it. Instead of retreating, Celeste surprised everyone by taking a step toward the stage. Her movement was deliberate, confident, nothing like the hesitant woman who had entered the ballroom 2 hours earlier. The crowd's chatter died as people realized they were witnessing something unexpected, something that didn't fit their comfortable assumptions about the silent woman with the violin case. She turned to me and signed with clear, determined movements. "Dad always said music speaks louder than words. Tonight, I'm going to prove him right." My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched her walk through the crowd toward Blackwell's stage. Every instinct screamed at me to stop her, to grab her arm and pull her away before she could be hurt any worse. This was my sister who hadn't spoken aloud in 20 years, who avoided public attention like it was poison, who had spent her entire adult life hiding from exactly this kind of scrutiny. But something in her posture stopped me cold. Her shoulders were set, her chin raised, and she carried Dad's violin case like it held a weapon instead of an instrument. This wasn't the same person who had signed frantically about feeling defenseless just moments before. This was someone I barely recognized, someone who had been waiting 20 years for exactly this moment. The entire ballroom fell silent as Celeste climbed the 3 steps to the stage. Even the waiters stopped moving, champagne glasses frozen halfway to their destinations. 300 of Manhattan's most powerful people held their collective breath, uncertain whether they were about to witness a disaster or something else entirely. Darius Blackwell stood near his precious Stradivarius with the satisfied smile of someone who believed he'd already won. "Take your time, sweetheart," he called out with mock generosity. "We're all very patient people here." Celeste ignored him completely. She set Dad's violin case on the piano bench and opened it with ritualistic care, her movements precise and unhurried despite the hundreds of eyes boring into her. The instrument gleamed under the stage lights, its aged wood reflecting decades of careful maintenance and countless hours of private practice. She lifted the violin to her shoulder and spent several minutes tuning it with the methodical attention of a surgeon preparing for operation. Each adjustment of the strings was deliberate, professional, the work of someone who understood that perfection required patience. The audience shifted restlessly, some probably hoping she would hurry up and fail so they could return to their champagne and gossip. But I knew better. I had watched Celeste tune this same violin thousands of times in Dad's music room, and I recognized the ritual for what it really was: preparation for war. She positioned the bow above the strings, closed her eyes, and for just a moment her lips moved silently. I knew she was repeating Dad's favorite words to her, the ones he had whispered every time she doubted herself. "Let the music be your voice, sweetheart. Let it tell them who you really are." When she opened her eyes again, the terrified woman, who had been publicly humiliated, was gone completely. In her place stood someone I had never seen before, a musician ready to claim her rightful place in the world. Celeste drew the bow across the strings, and the first note of Paganini's Caprice No. 24 filled the ballroom like a lightning strike. Not the tentative, scratchy sound everyone expected from an amateur, but a tone so pure and powerful it seemed to vibrate through the crystal chandeliers themselves. The piece she had chosen was musical suicide for most violinists. Caprice No. 24 is considered one of the most technically impossible compositions ever written, a piece that separates true virtuosos from everyone else who dares to pick up a violin. Most professional musicians spend years just attempting to play it competently. Celeste was performing it like she had been born to it. Her fingers moved across the strings with impossible precision, executing runs and arpeggios that should have been physically impossible for human hands. But this wasn't just technical mastery on display. Every note carried emotional weight, telling a story that words could never capture. You could hear her 20 years of silence in the music, her grief over Dad's death, her rage at being underestimated, her joy at finally having a voice that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. The transformation in the audience was immediate and complete. The smug whispers died instantly, replaced by dropped jaws and widening eyes. These were people who attended Carnegie Hall regularly, who knew the difference between competent playing and transcendent artistry, and they were witnessing something that defied every assumption they had made about the quiet woman on stage. Halfway through the piece, I forced myself to look at Darius Blackwell. The change in his face was almost comical. His practiced smile had vanished completely, replaced by shock so profound it looked like physical pain. This was a man who had built his entire identity on being the most talented violinist in any room, and he was watching someone destroy that assumption with every impossible note. As Celeste built toward the climax, her playing became even more intense, more emotionally raw. The violin sang and wept and soared, carrying 20 years of stored conversations, 20 years of thoughts and feelings that had never found their way past her lips. This wasn't just a performance anymore. This was a woman's entire soul being poured out through 4 strings and a bow. The technical passages that had broken the careers of countless musicians flowed from her fingers like water, but it was the emotion behind every phrase that left the audience breathless. She played with the kind of desperate beauty that comes from someone who has finally found their voice after a lifetime of silence. When she reached the final crescendo, building to notes so high and clear they seemed to pierce the air itself, I swear the entire room forgot to breathe. The chandeliers actually trembled with the power of the sound, and more than one person in the audience had tears streaming down their faces. Then came the ending. 4 final notes played with such devastating precision and emotional truth that they seemed to hang in the air long after the bow left the strings. The silence that followed wasn't the awkward quiet of people unsure how to react. It was the stunned silence of 300 people who had just witnessed something that would change them forever. 10 seconds passed. Then someone began to applaud, and the dam broke completely. The applause erupted like thunder, 300 people rising to their feet in the kind of ovation that careers are built on. But the most beautiful moment came when Leonard Morrison, the former conductor of the New York Philharmonic, stood in the front row with tears streaming down his weathered face. "My God," he whispered, his voice carrying across the sudden quiet between waves of applause. "That's how Heifetz used to play it." Celeste packed Dad's violin with the same careful precision she had used to tune it, seemingly unaffected by the chaos surrounding her. When Darius Blackwell tried to approach, probably scrambling to salvage his reputation by associating himself with her triumph, she simply walked past him like he didn't exist. The crowd parted for her like she was royalty, and for the first time in my life, I saw people looking at my sister with the respect she had always deserved. The immediate aftermath was surreal. Within 2 hours, videos of Celeste's performance were spreading across social media like wildfire. Someone had live-streamed the entire thing, and by morning, news outlets were calling it the most extraordinary musical moment of the decade. 3 major symphony orchestras had already called Mom's phone before we even left Carnegie Hall, and by the end of the week, Celeste had received 17 formal invitations to perform with orchestras across the country. But the real transformation wasn't in the headlines or the sudden fame, it was in Celeste herself. She didn't magically start speaking after that night, but everything else about her changed. She carried herself differently, met people's eyes directly, and began communicating more openly through her writing and signing. The woman who had spent 20 years hiding her light suddenly seemed comfortable letting it shine. 6 months later, Mom showed me a letter she had found in Dad's desk. He had been secretly arranging advanced lessons for Celeste with a retired Juilliard professor for 2 decades, paying him to come to the house twice a week when the rest of us weren't home. The letter revealed that Dad had always known this moment would come. that Celeste possessed a gift too powerful to remain hidden forever. He had been preparing her for the day when the world would finally be ready to listen. As for Darius Blackwell, his career never recovered from that night. The man who had built his reputation on humiliating others became the cautionary tale whispered in music circles about the dangers of arrogance. He still performs, but the invitations are fewer, the venues smaller, and everyone remembers the night he was shown what real talent looks like. Today, Celeste is the principal violinist with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, the first musician in their history to perform entirely without verbal communication with conductors or fellow musicians. She proved that silence doesn't mean absence of voice, that sometimes the people who have the most important things to say are simply waiting for the perfect moment to say them. The world finally learned to listen to my sister, and she's been speaking through her music ever since. Dad would have been so proud.